All right, let's dive in. Today we're talking about a war that was short, sharp, and had absolutely massive consequences. And it was all fought over this tiny, wind-swept group of islands, way, way down in the South Atlantic.
And that's the big question, right? Why on earth would two countries go to war over these places? Well, to really get what happened in 1982, we can't just start there. We have to rewind the clock. We're talking centuries of competing claims and a deep, deep sense of national identity.
So, depending on who you talk to, these islands are either the Malvinas, if you're Argentinian, or the Falklands, if you're British. And their history, wow, it is a tangled web of explorers showing up, planting a flag, and then someone else doing the exact same thing. It's a story where national pride got staked out on some pretty rugged territory.
You can just see right here how this all played out. It's kind of like a game of musical chairs, but with empires. First, a British captain lands way back in 1690. Then, more than 70 years later, the French show up and actually build the first settlement. They call it Les Malines, which is where the Spanish name Malvinas comes from. Of course, Spain then muscles in and takes over. But the real flashpoint, the one that defines the entire modern conflict, is 1833. That's when Britain sails back in, kicks out the small Argentine administration, and says, "This is ours." From that point on, it's been under continuous British rule.
Now, from Argentina's perspective, and they were a pretty new country back then, this was an act of theft. They saw it as an illegal seizure of territory that they believed they had inherited from the Spanish Empire. And so, the Malvinas question became more than just a political issue. It got woven into the very fabric of their national identity. It was a story of lost land, a symbol of something that had to be reclaimed.
So you've got this historical grievance, and it just simmers away for nearly 150 years. Think of it like a pot on a stove. Now let's fast forward to 1982. That pot is about to boil over, not because of some new legal argument, but because of the intense pressure cooker of politics inside Argentina itself. By the early 80s, Argentina was being run by a brutal military dictatorship, a junta. And the leader, General Galtieri, was in a whole lot of trouble. The economy was a complete mess, and people were getting more and more angry about human rights abuses and just how badly things were being run. He desperately needed a distraction, something to unite the country behind his failing regime.
And what's the one thing that could unite everybody? Reclaiming the beloved Malvinas. It was the ultimate patriotic card to play. So the junta made this colossal gamble. They figured an invasion would spark this huge wave of patriotism that would keep them in power. And they made a critical, fatal miscalculation. They just assumed that Britain, over 12,000 kilometers away, wouldn't bother fighting a real war for a few tiny islands.
They were wrong. So wrong. The Argentine leadership had fundamentally underestimated the Iron Lady herself, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
So, on April 2, 1982, Argentine forces land and take control of the islands. Thatcher's response was immediate and completely uncompromising. For her, this wasn't about some old historical debate. This was simple. A military dictatorship had invaded British sovereign territory. The principle was crystal clear. Aggression will not be allowed to stand.
And believe me, she wasn't just talking. Britain's commitment was undeniable. Within days, they had pulled together and sent out this massive naval task force. We're talking aircraft carriers, destroyers, the whole shebang. It was an incredible logistical feat, and it sent a very loud message to the world, and especially to the junta in Buenos Aires, that Britain was absolutely serious about retaking those islands by force.
And what came next was 74 days of war, fought in some of the harshest conditions you can imagine. On land, at sea, and in the air. A short but incredibly brutal conflict was about to begin.
The war at sea escalated in a huge way on May 2nd. The British nuclear-powered submarine HMS Conqueror found and sank the Argentine cruiser, the ARA General Belgrano. This was a hugely significant and, to this day, a very controversial moment in the war.
The sinking cost 323 people their lives. That's the single biggest loss of life in the entire conflict. It was a devastating blow, not just to the Argentine Navy, but to morale back home. After this happened, the rest of the Argentine fleet pretty much sailed back to port and stayed there for the rest of the war.
But Argentina's response was swift and deadly. Just 2 days later, their air force hit the British destroyer HMS Sheffield with a French-made Exocet missile. The ship was crippled and later sank. This was a shocking wake-up call for the British. This was not going to be an easy fight. The Argentine pilots, flying at the absolute edge of their capabilities, were a formidable enemy.
Despite all the risks, British forces landed on the islands and began this grueling campaign on the ground. They fought a series of really punishing battles for key pieces of high ground, places with names like Goose Green and Mount Tumbledown. They fought their way across the island, eventually surrounding the capital, Port Stanley. Outgunned and cut off, the Argentine forces there surrendered on June 14th, bringing the 74-day war to an end.
So the fighting was over. But the consequences of this short war would echo for decades, and they would completely reshape the political futures of both Argentina and the United Kingdom, but in profoundly different ways. I mean, just look at this contrast. It is night and day. In Argentina, the humiliating defeat directly led to the collapse of the military junta. Within a year, democracy was back after years of brutal repression. But in the UK, the victory was a massive boost for Margaret Thatcher. Her approval ratings went through the roof, it cemented her Iron Lady image, and she was propelled to a landslide election victory the next year. For many Argentinians, a measure of pride was restored, not on a battlefield, but on a soccer field. 4 years later, at the 1986 World Cup, Argentina faced England in this legendary quarterfinal match, and Diego Maradona scored two of the most famous goals in history, the infamous Hand of God goal, and a second one of just pure genius, to knock England out. For Argentina, it felt like this powerful symbolic revenge.
But what about the people who actually live there? What do they want? Well, the political status of the islands today, according to the inhabitants themselves, is crystal clear. In 2013, they held a referendum on their own future, and an overwhelming 99.8% of the islanders voted to remain a British overseas territory.
And this really brings us to our final thought. The guns went silent in 1982, but the echoes of that war still resonate today. While Britain sees the issue as settled by the principle of self-determination, for Argentina, the claim to the Malvinas remains a deeply emotional, unresolved national cause. It's like a wound that is never fully healed. And it's a powerful reminder that sometimes conflicts leave legacies that last far, far longer than the fighting itself.